You think family always has your back until they hand your life to someone else. What would you do if the home you fought for, every sacrifice and sleepless night, was gifted away while you weren't looking? I've always been the one who shows up, not the one who takes the spotlight, not the one whose laughter fills a room, but the one who quietly builds, brick by brick, every part of her life. My name is Clara, and by the age of 32, I had carved out a world entirely my own, in the heart of London. Tiny one-bedroom flat in Shoreditch, with a skyline that caught the sun at just the right angle in the mornings, was my fortress. Every scratch on the reclaimed wood coffee table, every crease in the vintage armchair, every carefully chosen frame on the wall whispered my story. Late nights at the office, sacrificed weekends, missed birthdays, and silent endurance. I grew up in Surrey, a place that smelled of wet leaves and freshly cut lawns, but never quite felt like home. My parents, loving in their selective way, had 2 daughters, and in their eyes, Chloe, my younger sister, was always the star. Ballet recitals were front-page events. Award ceremonies for me. Afterthoughts. Barely a polite nod. When I turned 16, my parents forgot to celebrate my birthday until a week later, offering me a supermarket cake that tasted of obligation. Chloe's 16th. A rented function hall. A DJ. A glittering celebration that seemed to scream, "Everything is hers." While I worked 3 jobs to fund my university degree, Chloe shifted through majors, gap years, and internships across Europe. Each adventure comfortably cushioned by our parents' wallet. I watched her glide through life, and I was proud of her in a quiet way. But every polite smile I gave carried a weight I didn't yet understand. The resentment simmered beneath the surface, but I never let it boil over. That wasn't my role. London changed me. My flat became my sanctuary, my evidence that persistence could create beauty even in the smallest spaces. From my morning coffee on the balcony, I could watch the city wake and feel, for the first time, that the world belonged to me in some small, sacred way. But every sanctuary has its walls, and those walls can be threatened, not by strangers, but by the people you love the most. It was during a Sunday roast, a ritual so ordinary it could hide any disaster, that the first fissure appeared. My parents, ever the arbiters of Chloe's destiny, had decided my home was now Chloe's temporary kingdom. They placed a set of keys on the table with the casual authority of people distributing a gift card. "Chloe will stay with you for a little while," my mother said. Her voice dipped in saccharine reassurance. "We've spoken to the concierge." My father's expression was smug with certainty. Chloe, predictably, smirked. I froze. The air thickened, as if the room itself realized a betrayal had landed. My pulse thundered, and my hands, resting lightly on my plate, felt suddenly foreign. These weren't just keys. They were a declaration that my hard-earned autonomy, my sanctuary, my carefully constructed life, could be handed over without so much as a question. And in that instant, a quiet, dangerous clarity washed over me. Something I hadn't allowed myself to feel for years surged through me. Not hurt, not anger, but resolve. They didn't know. I had already begun to rewrite the script. The clink of metal against the table should have sounded ordinary. Keys. Mundane. Harmless. But that single noise, the casual thud against polished oak, felt like a hammer striking my chest. My parents, smiling as if this were a gift for a child's birthday, had handed over more than metal and plastic. They'd handed over my life, my sanctuary, my painstakingly built independence. I looked at the keys as if they were a puzzle I could solve. My pulse hammered in my ears, louder than the conversation around me. The aroma of Sunday roast, usually comforting, now tasted like smoke in my mouth. I swallowed, hoping the moment would pass, but the betrayal hung there, heavy and undeniable. What do you mean?" My mother's voice wavered, breaking the strange silence I had fallen into. Her eyes, wide and frantic, darted between me and Chloe. My father's confident smile faltered. uncertainty creeping in like a shadow at dusk. Chloe's smirk slipped, replaced with a flicker of confusion. Had she expected me to simply accept this? I haven't lived there for 6 weeks, I said, my voice calm but edged with an icy certainty. Every syllable was deliberate, measured, designed to land like a punch, without warning. They blinked. They froze. I could see the gears turning behind their eyes, desperately trying to process a reality that contradicted every assumption they'd held about me. 6 weeks, my father stammered. His authority, so carefully maintained over decades, crumbled under the weight of a truth he hadn't anticipated. Yes, I continued. After I came home from a business trip, I found Chloe staying there, going through my private journals, bringing friends over as if I didn't exist. I moved out that night. The silence that followed was profound, suffocating. My mother's fork clattered to the plate. Chloe's lips parted, words caught somewhere between indignation and disbelief. My father leaned back, eyes wide, as if the air itself had shifted. The truth didn't just sting, it detonated. Their assumptions, their entitlement, the way they had always ranked Chloe above me, it all crumbled in that instant. I watched, detached yet burning inside, as their carefully curated reality splintered. You didn't tell us, Chloe said finally, her voice sharp, accusing. Why would you keep something like this from us? I leaned back in my chair, a strange quiet power settling over me. Because I didn't have to. My life isn't a story for you to control. For the first time, I felt the delicious, frightening clarity of autonomy, the rage that had simmered in me for years. Over overlooked birthdays, unequal opportunities, stolen recognition, surfaced. But it wasn't blind anger. It was precise, focused, a lens sharpening on every slight I had endured. My parents sputtered, cried, tried to guilt me, wielded every familiar weapon in their arsenal. Pleas, accusations, the old rhetoric of family duty, but it bounced off the walls I had built in my mind. The role I had been assigned for decades, the obedient, invisible daughter, was no longer mine to play. I realized something then. They had underestimated me. Not once had they considered that I might reclaim my narrative in a way they couldn't. Control. That their casual handover of my home would become the spark for something larger, something they couldn't undo. And in that moment, the fracture wasn't just in our conversation. It was in the foundation of the life they thought they controlled. After that Sunday dinner, silence became my closest ally. Not the kind of comfortable silence that wraps you like a soft blanket, but the heavy, electrified kind that hums in your chest when everything familiar has shifted. I went home that night, not to Shoreditch, not to the flat that was no longer mine, but to a temporary Airbnb in Camden. It was modest, small, yet brimming with possibility. I could feel it in my bones. The world had tilted, and I was finally on level ground again, alone, free. Yet freedom has its price. That same week, I returned briefly to Shoreditch, not to live, but to retrieve the things that mattered most. Journals, photographs, mementos of victories no one had celebrated. The flat smelled faintly of Chloe now. Cologne, perfume, laughter that wasn't mine, and each step I took felt like walking through a betrayal etched in wallpaper and wood. I remember standing by the window, watching the city lights reflect off glass towers, and feeling an unfamiliar surge of anger and exhilaration. The violation was intimate, personal. Chloe hadn't just walked into my home. She had crossed into my mind, rifled through the pages where my thoughts were laid bare. My parents' complacency had made it possible. Their unquestioned favoritism, the accomplice. That night, I called my best friend, my voice breaking into fragments of rage and despair. I can't believe they do this, I said, gripping the phone like a lifeline. It's like my entire life is theirs to hand over. You don't have to keep the role they assigned you, she said softly, You're allowed to rewrite the script. Those words, so simple, so ordinary, hit me like a hammer. Rewrite the script. Not just leave, not just reclaim a flat, but redraw every line of my story, every boundary, every act of respect I had been denied. That was the catalyst. The point where resignation turned into resolve. The next morning, I started planning, not impulsively, not with vengeance in its rawest, most chaotic form, but methodically. I would make no declarations, write no confrontational emails, leave no breadcrumbs. My strategy was invisibility, precision, and patience. Every step had to be deliberate. Every move had to be mine alone. I found a sunny walk-up in Camden, tucked down a quiet street where the morning sun painted the walls gold. I opened a new bank account, a P.O. box, everything my family didn't know about. The flat became more than a shelter. It was a statement, a life built without interference, unassailable. At the same time, my mind replayed every slight, every overlooked achievement, every casual handover of my agency. Anger mixed with clarity. Betrayal now had a purpose. Chloe and my parents had set the stage for their own unraveling, and I had the script in my hands. I began to see the contours of what was possible. Not humiliation, not cruelty, but a reclamation, a quiet, irreversible shift that would remind them, without words, that I was no longer their invisible daughter, that my life belonged to me, and that realization, that sweet, terrifying clarity, became the point of ignition. I was no longer just hurt. I was awake, deliberate, and unyielding. The stage had been set, the actors unaware, and the story would finally be mine. Obsession is not always loud. Often it whispers in the quiet moments, in the spaces between decisions, in the meticulous attention paid to every detail. For me, it began with small, almost invisible rituals. Every morning in my new Camden flat, I traced a finger along the edge of my desk, checked the locks, catalogued my possessions, and imagined every scenario in which my family could overstep and how I would respond. It was a private rehearsal of power. I knew my anger could consume me if I let it, so I harnessed it instead. I became a master of deliberate patience. Chloe's entitlement, my parents' habitual assumptions, became fuel. Every slight, every unspoken comparison that had haunted me since childhood, transformed into data, patterns of behavior I could anticipate, predict, and manipulate. I walked the streets of Camden, coffee in hand, feeling the sun on my face, thinking about Shoreditch, the flat that had been my sanctuary, now a trap waiting to snap shut on them. Felt like a chessboard. Each piece, my parents, Chloe, even mutual friends, had predictable moves, and I would counter them silently, invisibly. Night after night, I mapped the Shoreditch flat, which rooms Chloe would likely claim first, how long it would take before she noticed my absence, which personal items would signal my invisible presence. I imagined her reaching for a favorite mug, only to find it missing, or rifling through my journals, reading the pages that I had left behind, feeling the sting of boundaries she had violated. It was not cruelty, it was reclamation. Every action was purposeful, every omission deliberate. I was no longer just Clara, the obedient daughter, the reliable sister. I was Clara, the architect of her own destiny, the curator of consequence. Sleep became a structured affair, measured to keep my mind sharp. I kept lists, revising them daily. Tasks, contingencies, potential pitfalls. I found a quiet corner in a local cafe where the barista knew my order, a place where I could observe without being observed. I started to understand the exhilaration of control, how intoxicating it is to know that the world you had been excluded from could be shaped by your hands alone. And yet, beneath the methodical planning, there was a shadow. Doubt, guilt, even fleeting pangs of fear crept in. Sometimes, in the quietest hours, I would ask myself, am I becoming the person I once despised? Am I crossing a line? But the answers were always the same. I had already crossed the line when they handed Chloe my home. When they dismissed me as invisible, I was merely reclaiming what was mine. By the third week, my transformation was complete. I was no longer reactive. I was proactive. Every action Chloe might take, every plea from my parents, every assumption they held about me being compliant, could be anticipated and neutralized. I had become both strategist and protagonist in my own story, a stark contrast to the shadowy role they had always assigned me. The obsession wasn't chaotic. It was precise, sculpted like a blade, honed for one purpose: to ensure that when the time came, I would step into the light of my own making, and they would finally see the consequences of underestimating me. And so I waited, quietly, patiently, watching, calculating, transforming every slight into strategy, every betrayal into a building block for the story that was now mine to write. Preparation is a quiet kind of violence. It hums in the back of your mind, a persistent pulse that never lets you rest. For 6 weeks, I transformed my life in ways no one would notice. No dramatic exits, no confrontations, no announcements. Every step was deliberate, calculated, a silent reclamation of autonomy that they could neither see nor anticipate. The first task was physical, moving the essentials, the pieces of my life that carried memory and meaning. Journals, photographs, letters tucked away in boxes I labeled meticulously. Each item I carried to Camden was a fragment of my story, preserved and protected. I left behind the furniture, the trinkets, the things Chloe might claim, for them to encounter a hollow flat, the shell of my old life, ripe for their surprise. I opened a new bank account, one my parents didn't know about. Every transaction, every delivery, every subscription was private, invisible. The Shoreditch flat became a phantom, a space that existed in law, but not in life. My absence would speak louder than any words. At night, I walked the streets around Camden, memorizing every alley, every corner, every cafe that might serve as a lookout, a retreat, a place to breathe when the pressure of my plan threatened to crush me. The barista who knew my order became an unwitting ally in this theater of invisibility. The local grocer, the postal clerk, even the neighbors who nodded politely, all contributed to the illusion of a life seamlessly rebuilt. Every day I practiced restraint. I resisted the urge to announce my absence, to confront, to justify. Instead, I observed how my parents called the flat, how Chloe expected a welcoming home, how the absence of my signature belongings began to unsettle them. I kept detailed mental notes, cataloging reactions, recalibrating my next steps. I also prepared myself psychologically. Long evenings were spent rehearsing conversations, imagining the pleas, the gaslighting, the guilt trips that were inevitable. I visualized staying calm, unflinching, and measured. My voice had to carry authority, but my face, my expressions, had to remain inscrutable. I couldn't allow them to detect any hint of vulnerability. They had weaponized mine for decades. Meals became rituals of focus. I would sit alone, notebook open, sketching timelines and contingency plans. I studied Chloe's habits, which room she would occupy first, how long it would take her to notice the missing items, which of my possessions would provoke a reaction. I wasn't just moving furniture. I was engineering consequences. There were nights when the isolation gnawed at me, the quiet apartment, the empty streets, the absence of anyone to share this transformation with. It pressed against my chest, but each pang was a reminder. Freedom demanded solitude, clarity demanded patience, and power demanded preparation. By the end of the 6th week, everything was aligned. My new life in Camden was functional, secure, and invisible. The Shoreditch flat was a trap poised for discovery. A stage for a performance they never realized was already written. I had become the silent force in a story that had long tried to exclude me, and every meticulous step I had taken had forged the path to my quiet, inevitable triumph. The first move is the most intoxicating. It is quiet, almost invisible. Yet it carries the unmistakable weight of intent. I didn't need confrontation or spectacle. I needed precision, the kind that makes a person question their assumptions before the truth ever arrives. It started with small signals at the Shoreditch flat. I had arranged for minor maintenance issues to be reported to the building staff. A leaking faucet, a flickering light, the security gate that occasionally jammed. Each problem was true, yet inconspicuous, enough to unsettle Chloe, to plant a subtle discomfort, a hint that the space she assumed was hers was not as effortless to occupy as she thought. Then came the personal touches. A missing mug here, a journal relocated there, carefully positioned to hint at someone else's presence without revealing me. Every subtle shift was calculated to provoke uncertainty, curiosity, and ultimately doubt. Chloe didn't know I had moved out. She assumed my belongings were accessible. The minor disruptions created cracks in her confidence. I observed silently from Camden. Emails from the concierge. Updates from the building manager. Small complaints from Chloe. Each report delivered a thrill that mingled with a strange tenderness. I wasn't just dismantling a sense of entitlement. I was reclaiming control. And for the first time in years, the universe felt responsive to my intentions. I also tested boundaries with my parents. Calls and texts came in, dripping with expectation and manipulation. Chloe was flustered. My parents were frantic, but I didn't respond immediately. Sometimes I let messages linger for hours, just long enough to let them feel the void of my absence. It was a silent reminder that I no longer belonged to their assumptions. There were moments when the thrill of invisibility made me almost giddy. Watching them flounder, powerless to anticipate my next step, was unlike anything I had experienced. My revenge wasn't loud or cruel. It was strategic, subtle, surgical. Every tiny shift, every carefully orchestrated inconvenience, was a move on a board that only I could see. And yet, even in the satisfaction, there was awareness. Power is seductive, yes, but also dangerous. I reminded myself daily that my goal was reclamation, not destruction. I was taking back my story, asserting my boundaries, and forcing recognition, not vengeance for its own sake. By the end of that first week of subtle moves, the balance had shifted. Chloe's confidence faltered. My parents' assumption of control wavered. The first cracks were visible. They could feel, vaguely, that something was different, but they didn't know what or who was orchestrating it, and that uncertainty was mine to wield. Quietly, mercilessly, and with unshakable precision. By the third week of my subtle campaign, something had changed. I was no longer testing boundaries or probing reactions. The stage was set, the pieces aligned, and the path forward was clear. There was no turning back. The Shoreditch flat, once a sanctuary, then a battleground, was now a trap poised for discovery. Every choice I had made, every careful step, had led to this moment, the irrevocable act of reclaiming my life. I moved with purpose, unseen and untouchable. The Camden apartment was fully functional, every item in place, every space curated for security and comfort, but my attention remained on Shoreditch. I imagined Chloe entering the flat, the confident smirk she always wore, and then the flicker of confusion, the subtle panic of entitlement colliding with absence. I rehearsed each reaction, savoring the precision of timing. Messages from my parents became more frantic. Calls increased in frequency, ranging from worried inquiries to guilt-laden pleas. Chloe, oblivious to my presence, sent casual texts, expecting guidance or assistance. I let every message sit unread, just long enough to let the weight of expectations settle on them. The invisible power I held was intoxicating. I also fortified my Camden life. Secret deliveries, untraceable payments, and carefully scheduled routines ensured I could operate without interruption. This wasn't just planning. It was creating a life so separate, so untouchable, that my family's attempts to intrude would crumble on contact. My independence had become absolute, and yet, the thrill was laced with a tinge of fear. Crossing this threshold meant that even if I chose later to reconnect with my family, the dynamics had shifted irreversibly. I had abandoned the old role, the obedient, reliable daughter, and assumed a new identity, the architect of consequence. The stakes were high, but clarity had replaced doubt. The moment of no return is not always dramatic. Often it is a quiet realization that you have committed fully to a course of action, and the consequences, both sweet and bitter, are inevitable. For me, it arrived in a flash of awareness while sipping coffee in Camden. I could never go back to being the Clara who acquiesced, who endured silently, who let Chloe glide through life unchecked. That Clara was gone. From that point on, every action, every observation, every subtle move at the Shoreditch flat became part of a larger narrative. The plan was no longer a draft. It was reality. The trap was invisible, the tension real, and I, finally, was fully in control. There was no rewinding the story. The curtain was rising, and the world was about to see the consequences of taking me and my life for granted. Collapse never announces itself. It begins as a tremor, subtle and ignorable, before spreading through every beam and joint until the structure can no longer stand. For Chloe, the first tremor came in the form of absence. My absence. She had grown so accustomed to leaning on me that when the scaffolding vanished, her world buckled. The reports from the Shoreditch flat became frantic. Keys misplaced, parcels undelivered, the concierge unsure of instructions, because I had revoked my authorizations. Chloe's messages shifted from casual to sharp, tinged with irritation. Then came the late-night calls. Angry, desperate, pleading. Where are you? You can't just leave me to deal with this. Her entitlement cracked, revealing the fragile panic beneath. My parents were no better. Without me mediating, their polished image began to tarnish. Meetings missed, bills unpaid, small oversights magnified into public embarrassments. They tried to summon me back with guilt, threats, and promises. But each attempt only underscored their dependency. They were unraveling. And the beauty of it was that I didn't lift a finger. Their collapse was self-inflicted. I had simply stepped aside and let gravity do its work. The real climax arrived one grey morning. Chloe stormed into the Shoreditch flat, only to find her perfect life stripped bare. I had retrieved what was mine, meticulously and silently. The wardrobe half empty, the desk drawer cleared, my books gone, my presence erased. What remained was her chaos, magnified by the absence of the order I once maintained. When she finally called me, voice trembling, fury edged with fear, I answered. My silence on the line was deliberate. Let her fill it with accusations, with pleas, with disbelief. I listened, steady, unshaken, until she faltered. Then I said the words that shifted the axis. You never noticed until I was gone. The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. For the first time, Chloe understood that she was in the center, that my presence had been the quiet engine, keeping everything intact. My parents learned the same lesson in parallel. As their own unraveling became undeniable, it wasn't revenge that thrilled me most. It was recognition. At last, they saw the invisible labor, the sacrifices, the quiet loyalty they had mistaken for weakness. The collapse wasn't about destruction. It was about revelation. The truth had been dragged into the light, and none of them could pretend otherwise. And as they stood in the ruins of their entitlement, I stood apart, unburdened, untouched, and entirely free. After collapse comes silence. Not the silence of tension or waiting, but the kind that follows a storm when the air feels raw, washed clean. That was the silence I found in Camden. I no longer checked Shoreditch. I no longer traced their messages or hovered over unanswered calls. The frenzy, the chaos, the endless cycle of guilt and obligation. It was all happening without me. And for once, I didn't feel compelled to fix it. Their lives spun noisily in the distance, but mine finally moved at its own pace. The apartment became more than a sanctuary. It was proof that I could exist without being tethered to Chloe's entitlement or my parents' manipulation. Every item I chose, every routine I shaped, became a quiet rebellion written into the walls. In Camden, I wasn't the dutiful daughter or the invisible sibling. I was simply Clara. But freedom is never without its weight. Some nights, the silence felt heavy. I thought about Chloe's trembling voice, my mother's frantic texts, the faint edge of my father's shame. I had burned the old bridge, and though I didn't regret it, I understood there was no walking back across. Distance was no longer a choice. It was my reality, and yet this was the cost of being seen. For years I had carried their burdens, erased myself to keep their world intact. Now by stepping away, I had forced them to see the truth. Whether they admitted it or not, they knew who had held everything together. I didn't crave reconciliation. What I wanted was balance, an existence on my own terms, not defined by their expectations. The collapse had freed me, but it also reminded me of something deeper. Revenge is not always fire and fury. Sometimes it is absence. Sometimes it is silence. Sometimes it is the decision to walk away and let others stumble without you. As I stood by the Camden window one evening, the city glowing in the dusk, I realized I hadn't just reclaimed my space. I had reclaimed myself. My life was no longer theirs to consume. It was mine at last, and that was the sweetest revenge of all.